Dr. Daniller, you are a research associate focusing on politics at Pew Research Center. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, I'm very happy to be here.
Wonderful. Well, on this episode of Policy Chats, I think it's really important to discuss something going on almost every day in America. And most recently this weekend, there were quite a few cases of gun violence. And I understand that Pew Research Center has pretty recent data on and surveys from the American public. So I'm curious, pulling from data gathered by Pew Research Center, is gun violence seen as a problem in the United States, and is it viewed as a partisan issue?
Yeah, so this is a really good question for getting into the topic. And what we found in our most recent survey, which was conducted during the first week or so of April, between April 5th and April 11th of this year, about half of Americans told us that gun violence is a very big problem in the country today. And so to put that in context, we asked about 15 different problems in this particular survey, or potential problems, and gun violence ranked as number 5 out of those 15. So, for example, the top issue was the affordability of healthcare, which is something that we typically see at the top or near the top of these kinds of survey questions. Gun violence, I wouldn't say, jumped out as necessarily the most important topic, but with about half of Americans saying that it's a very big problem, then clearly that's something that matters to people right now. And as far as the partisan aspect of it goes, yes, absolutely. This is a question where we see an especially large partisan divide in terms of who sees it as a problem and who doesn't. Among Democrats and people who lean towards the Democratic Party, gun violence was actually the number 1 issue when we asked this question in April. However, only about 2 in 10 Republicans told us that gun violence was a very big problem, compared with around 3/4 of Democrats. And so for Republicans, this ranked as number 13 out of those 15 issues. So, number 1 among Democrats, pretty close to the bottom among Republicans. And that's among the largest party gaps of any of the issues that we asked about this time around.
Now, it's very interesting that it's not just like, oh, a little bit of a difference. It's like a complete difference, like one at the top, one at the bottom. So it just shows like the importance in different parties, that what we see as a threat or an issue in America. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and one thing that I do think is worth kind of emphasizing early on as we get into some of the more details around this data is the timing of the survey. So as I said, this was conducted April 5th to April 11th. And of course, with gun violence being something that is in the news and then out of the news and then in the news again, obviously, it's one of the issues where people's attention can fluctuate a little bit depending on what's going on in the world, what they've heard about recently. So to try to put it in a little bit more context beyond just giving you those dates, this was just after the shootings that occurred in Atlanta in March, as well as the shooting in Boulder, Colorado. I believe that was in a grocery store. So those were a couple of incidents that got a lot of attention in the media and among the public. But it did occur before the one at the FedEx facility in Indianapolis. That was towards the middle of April, after our survey had left the field. So just to try to put the timeline in a bit more context for folks who might be listening, that's where our survey actually fell at this particular time. So.
Yeah, context is very important. Yeah, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so of course people will rank healthcare. You would assume healthcare would be at the top, but it's like just showing that a lot of people still find that gun violence is still a very top issue. Is very important.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the pandemic. Of course, when we asked this question about a year ago, the pandemic was very close to the top. It's actually dropped a little bit as far as where people rank it, the biggest problems facing the country right now. But yes, that's a great example of how the context can really affect these types of the answers to these types of questions.
Perfect. So in the article, you also talk about mental illness and how people associate mental illness with gun violence in the US. Has data shown that Americans favor preventing people diagnosed with a mental illness from purchasing guns?
Yeah, this is another really good question. We do find that one of the most popular policy proposals we ask about related to guns is preventing people with mental illnesses from purchasing firearms. I do want to be careful there about how we talk about the relationship between mental illness and gun violence. As you said, Jen, there's definitely a public perception that the two things are linked, but our survey data really can't speak to whether there's actually a relationship there. What we can talk about and what our data is very good for is showing how people view the different policy proposals and the different policy options that are being talked about. And in this particular case, we find that a large majority of Americans, almost 9 in 10, tell us that they would either favor or strongly favor preventing people with mental illness from purchasing guns. And as I said, that's the most popular of the policy options that we asked about in this particular survey. 70% of people told us that they strongly favored this particular option. And unusually in this context, both Democrats and Republicans were broadly in favor of limiting gun sales to people with mental illness. We had large majorities of both Republicans and Democrats, which isn't the case on a lot of the other items that we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, so there's different ways of people thinking that, oh, if we prevent these certain people from purchasing guns, do survey results show that Americans oppose or support background checks when buying guns? Think it'll make it safer if we know the background of a person?
Yeah, so expanded background checks are another proposal that was fairly popular in this particular survey. Currently, at least at the federal level, it's a background check is not required for people who purchase guns at private sales or at gun shows. And so our specific survey item asked whether people would favor expanding background checks to those two types of sales for guns. And what we found was that about 8 in 10 favored expanded background checks in that context, including about 6 in 10 who would strongly favor that type of restriction or that type of additional check. And once again, this was one of the small number of questions that Republicans and Democrats generally agreed on. Democrats overwhelmingly favor expanded background checks. Republicans, it's somewhere around 70% of Republicans who say that they would favor this. So still a broad majority, but not quite as strong as among the Democrats.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for letting us know. And I think it's important to have these numbers to reflect really where the public does stand on these issues. And at least in debates and online, it seems we can't agree anywhere. So it's nice to know maybe in small portions on this topic, we can find agreement. But also throughout the years, various politicians have called for bans on both assault-style weapons and high-capacity magazines. Do you happen to know where the American public stands on this policy proposal?
Yeah, so this is well, both of these cases are ones where there's a bit more of a partisan divide. What we see is that majorities support both types of bans. That would be bans on assault-style weapons being sold, as well as bans on high-capacity magazines, which we defined, I believe, as magazines that could fire 10 or more rounds at a time. Obviously, there are a lot of different definitions you can use there, but that was the definition we offered in this survey. So we do find that majorities support both of those proposals, but as I said, with big partisan differences. Democrats are, again, strongly in favor of both of these options, whereas Republicans in this case, we found that less than a majority of Republicans supported each of these ideas individually. So it's a case where maybe the parties are a bit farther apart, even if overall in the public we see something like 60 to 65% of people telling us that they support each of these proposals individually.
Yes, so to move on, An important issue raised in your article is the debate on whether an increase in Americans owning guns would result in more or less crime. Can you speak on what the data shows Americans think about the issue in terms of race, political party, and even geographic location?
Absolutely. So we did ask two related but slightly different questions here. First, we asked whether people believe that if more Americans owned guns, there would be more or less crime. And then we also asked a second related question, which was about whether if guns were harder to obtain legally, there would be more or fewer mass shootings. So, first you asked about crime, so let's focus on that here. But I do want to point out that we have these two related questions, and I'm sure we'll get to the second one in a minute. So, in terms of whether more Americans owning guns would lead to more or less crime, what we find is, again, a pretty large divide among people based on party, but we also see some important demographic differences. Excuse me. So in terms of race and ethnicity, we find that a majority of Black adults tell us that if more Americans own guns, there would also be more crime. Hispanic adults are about evenly divided. Just about half of Hispanic adults say this. But among white adults, just a quarter say that if more people owned guns, there would be more crime. So we see, that's one of the larger differences by race and ethnicity that we saw in this particular survey, where especially Black adults and white adults are pretty far apart. Hispanics are in the middle of those two groups, but they are closer to where the Black adults are than to where the white adults are. We also see, as you hinted at in your question, we also see not what I would call geographic divides necessarily, but divides by the type of community that people live in. So among people who tell us that they live in an urban setting, 50%, again, half of people in that type of setting, tell us that if more Americans owned guns, there would also be more crime. Among people who live in rural communities, only 23% say this. So that's a pretty large gap between those who live in cities versus those who live in more rural locations. And that's something we see in the context of a few of the questions we asked about guns, is that not only are there partisan divides or divides along other demographic lines, but this urban, suburban, rural divide does matter in how people view gun policy and gun violence.
Perfect. I'm just curious. I know this focus is on gun policy, but I do think it's very interesting to see a difference between urban and rural. Has the Pew Research Center found this difference in geographic location in many surveys?
Yeah, it certainly depends on what type of issue we're talking about, but just to take an example near the top of my head, something that we've looked at over the last year is the way that geography and community type impact different views related to the pandemic. And certainly, especially early on in the pandemic, when the big outbreak was centered in New York City, we were definitely seeing differences in opinion about the correct responses to the pandemic, about how government was handling the pandemic, about all sorts of things related to the pandemic that were divided along those lines of urban, suburban, rural communities. So it is something that fortunately, the way we've approached surveys in the last several years, especially using our American Trends panel, where we have a lot of background data about the individuals who take each of our surveys, we're able to look at these types of geographic questions and these types of community questions. And it does give us some additional insight that we weren't always able to get from traditional random sample phone surveys. And I should just clarify that our panel is also based on a random sample, but it's a random sample where we're able to interview the same individuals repeatedly over a period of months and years. And so that gives us some additional data about who they are, where they live, all those sorts of things.
Oh,
that's so interesting. That's wonderful. I think it is important to know where the data is coming from, to trust and believe in it. But I would like to talk about that second part of the question that you had mentioned when covering crime. And unfortunately, that is mass shootings, something that America has witnessed far too many times, and quite a few happened this past weekend. There is an argument that claims that making it harder to legally obtain guns would result in fewer mass shootings. Again, similar to what you were saying on that question about reducing crime. What do Americans seem to believe in this connection, but with mass shootings?
Yeah, so as I said, we asked folks whether if it were harder to legally obtain guns, if that would reduce the number of mass shootings. And we saw a similar sort of divide based on the types of communities people live in that I just mentioned for the violent crime question. However, something we also saw in this particular case, talking about mass shootings, is that there's a pretty large divide based around age. So the youngest set of adults in our survey, those who are ages 18 to 30, or I should say 18 to 29, that group of adults, a majority of them, about 60%, tell us that there would be fewer mass shootings if it were harder to legally obtain guns. Among the oldest group of adults that we look at, those who are 65 and older, 40% say the same thing. So the question is really dependent on, I'm not going to speculate about what the reasons for that are, but this is definitely one aspect of the gun debate where we do see some differences by age that don't always appear in some of the other questions that we've asked.
Yeah, and like, of course, we don't want to speculate, but I feel like young people have been exposed to these mass shootings in a capacity that I feel like no generation has ever seen. So I feel like it'll make sense that the young people would say, maybe we had less guns, there'll be less shootings, but of course, we just have the data to look at.
Right. Unfortunately, our data doesn't let us ask why this particular finding is the case, so we can't really speak to that. But certainly the hypothesis you're suggesting there is one that would be worth looking at in additional research, and seeing exactly how younger folks differ from older adults when it comes to these types of questions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, perfect. So to continue now, does data show any trends beyond political standing in regards to who supports or opposes stricter gun laws in America?
So, as with a lot of public policy questions and political questions right now, some of the biggest divisions that we see are along partisan lines. As students, I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of ongoing debate about whether Americans have really become more polarized or not over the last couple of decades. A lot of our data at Pew Research Center suggests that they have, and this is one of those topic areas where that seems to be the case. Democrats and Republicans are far apart in how they view gun crime and gun violence. But with that said, we've already touched on some of the areas where there are divisions. Of course, we talked about the type of community that people lived in a few minutes ago. We also see divisions among men versus women, where, in this survey, for example, women tended to be slightly more supportive of restrictions on gun purchases than men were. We see some divisions on race and ethnic lines, where Black adults, white adults, Hispanic adults, and Asian adults present slightly different opinions on average. And we also see some divisions along age and educational lines. So again, speaking very generally, people with more formal education tend to be a bit more supportive of stricter gun laws than people with fewer years of formal education.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting. I'm also wondering in terms of trends. I'm not sure how far back data on this specific topic goes, but say following Columbine or the Sandy Hook mass shooting or the Parkland shooting, and I know this was taken just following the Atlanta mass shooting. Do you see spikes following or these very large mass shootings that gather a lot of press and maybe stay in the news longer than other cases of gun violence?
Yeah, so unfortunately, that question requires a bit more data than I sort of have at the top of mind, able to discuss in detail with you right now. It's a really good question though, and it's one where I'm sure there's a strong scientific literature that can speak to that. What I can say is that in terms of the Pew Research Center's trends, we do have data on these types of questions that go back several years, but gun policy and gun violence is one of the areas where we sometimes see mode differences, which is to say that as we've switched from looking almost exclusively at telephone surveys earlier on, up until maybe 5 years ago, versus today where we're primarily focused on data that comes from our online panel of American adults, we sometimes see differences in the way people respond that can be attributed to the different ways that these questions are asked on the phone from a live interviewer versus taking the survey online. And so that can complicate some of our long-term trends on these questions. In sort of the short term, and in the report that we're talking about today, we are able to go back to 2017, 2016 on some of these questions and look at the ways that that Americans' opinions about gun policy have changed just over the last few years. But as we start to go back farther than that, and this is an issue in the much broader world of survey research where responses to phone surveys have declined over time, and we could have a whole long conversation about all of those issues. But the trends do get a little bit complicated. So it's hard for me to draw a direct line from, say, Columbine, which is an example that you mentioned, versus a more recent mass shooting like, say, what happened at Sandy Hook a few years ago, or even something that happened this year, like the shooting in Indianapolis that I mentioned, or the one in Boulder, Colorado. So it's a complicated question, but it's also a really important one. And I don't want to give any oversimplified answers in trying to address it.
Of course, of course. I think that one question could probably take up an entire episode. So
I think that's probably true, yes.
so maybe we'll have to circle back to that one day here soon. But as we wrap up, this has been such a great conversation, but it has shown that there is great partisan division over gun policy for the most part. So I'm just curious if data has shown that this divide has grown stronger or weaker over the years, and if data provides any area in which the American public can compromise or come together to combat this issue in the near future.
Sure. And so this is an area where we do have really good data just from the last several years, where we can say that on some of these questions, yes, the partisan divide has grown. For example, on the question of whether there should be a ban on the sale of assault-style weapons, what we find is that Republicans have become a bit less supportive of that type of ban since 2017 or so, just over the last few years. On the other hand, the question that we talked about much earlier in this discussion, whether there should be more done to prevent people who have mental illnesses from buying weapons. That question, the share in both parties who say that they would support that type of policy has held pretty steady over the exact same period of time. There really hasn't been much change among either Democrats or Republicans. So yes, there are issues and there are specific policy proposals where the parties continue to grow apart, but there are some where really public opinion hasn't changed all that much, at least in the last few years. So it's again, a case where there's not one clear definitive answer that I can give you, but looking at some of the specific policies, we do see relatively high levels of agreement among both Democrats and Republicans.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Daniller, this has been just a wonderful conversation, and I think it's something that affects many Americans, and I'm sure many of our listeners. So I hope this data helps them maybe formulate their own opinion and just help know maybe why there's great controversy, and there are numbers to back up why each side, stands their ground on this issue. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really wonderful speaking with you.
Sure, sure. As I said, I was happy to be here, and I hope this was informative for those listening.